Perfect. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Anthony Locke with Torrey Hills Capital, and I want to welcome you to the Delcath Systems webcast for August 17th, 2021. I hope you're all doing well under the circumstances, and I want to thank you for attending today's virtual presentation. We are very excited to bring you Delcath Systems today. Delcath Systems is an interventional oncology company focused on the treatment of patients with primary and metastatic cancers of the liver. The company's investigational product, Hepzato Kit, is designed to administer high-dose chemotherapy to the liver while controlling systematic exposure and associated side effects. Delcath Systems trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker DCTH. Delcath shares are currently trading around $8.80 per share US, representing a market cap of only $65 million. So we feel there is plenty of upside as the company continues to make progress with its current trials. With us today to discuss Delcath Systems and the company's strategy going forward is CEO Gerard Michel. We also have Dr. Mark Swain, the editor of BioPub and Torrey Hills Capital's resident expert on all things biotech and pharma. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. It's great to have you on.
Thanks Anthony.
Yeah. I just want to say, Mark, before we get started, if our viewers have any questions during the presentation, I think the easiest way is to simply type it into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that it gets answered. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Swain for some opening comments. Then Gerard Michel will take us through the investor presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. With that said, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anthony. After a bit of a summer break, it's a real pleasure to be back on the air talking about Delcath with our friend Gerard Michel, and wanted to give you a bit of what I hope will be an enthusiastic endorsement by way of lead-in, which is to say that I'm a hepatologist and practiced for some years at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, great cancer hospital, where this scenario of the patient with metastatic disease largely confined to liver presented itself frequently. And we dabbled in various approaches to that problem, to that set piece of problems. And we never got nearly as good as Delcath has gotten here. And I should say, had we stumbled on to the clever set of ideas and approaches that are part of their bundled approach here, we would have called that a rousing success. I think the company, in my opinion, is very underpriced here. I personally am an investor and plan on raising that position. We're not trying to give you investing advice, do your own due diligence, but I think it's a company flying below radar and really worthy of consideration. And really delighted to have Gerard back with us, and I'm not going to steal any more of his time. It's a great story he has to tell us.
All right, thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here again. So as we typically do, I'm going to start out with the forward-looking statements. I won't read all of this, thankfully, but please refer to our filings with the SEC for a more complete disclosure of risks and facts before you invest. Now, Delcath is, I would argue, a unique opportunity. It is, forgive the stumbles here when you're on Zoom. I have to learn how to get the various faces out of my way so I can read my own slides. There we go. It is a what we call a percutaneous hepatic perfusion drug device platform. And I will sometimes refer to this as the generic term for the drug device combination platform. Other times I will refer to it as Hepzato Kit, which is the brand name in the US when it's bundled with the drug, melphalan. And sometimes I refer to it as chemo, which is how it's referred to in the EU, where it's approved under a CE mark. And it's sold just as the kit, and they buy the melphalan product from one of the suppliers of that drug. What PHP does is provide with limited systemic exposure, so you don't get much more outside of the liver. This is a big problem. Liver-dominant cancers are about 200,000 per year in the US and the EU, and they're very difficult to treat. And because of that, there have been a number of interventional mechanisms, interventional oncology mechanisms to treat the liver specifically. And there are about 100,000 of those treatments a year. So that it is an established treatment modality to go after just the liver. But the treatments that exist have some real shortcomings, which I'll go into in a moment. What we have is a late-stage de-risk program. We've already announced preliminary results from enough patients to be certain we've hit our primary endpoint, which is objective response rate. And that greatly exceeded the pre-specified success criterion in this single-arm trial. We expect to file at the end of the first quarter the NDA, and the NDA is actually a response to a complete response letter. I'll go into that in a moment, for Hepzato KIT and our first indication, metastatic ocular melanoma, a tumor that starts in the eye and spreads to the liver. We've done sold about 1,000 PHP commercial treatments as chemosat in the EU under that CE mark. There's very little reimbursement at this moment because there hasn't been a robust phase 3 trial showing good safety and efficacy. So a lot of that's been out of pocket, or the hospitals lobbying their local authorities to get the money. But about 1,000 treatments has shown real world efficacy and safety, which is important. The product or platform has meaningful revenue potential both in the near term in metastatic ocular melanoma, and much larger potential in the longer term if we start treating across broader tumor types. So about $300 million a year is the TAM, target addressable market, in the US and the EU, we believe. And there's no current standard of care in metastatic ocular melanoma. And then there's existing proof of principle and additional indications totaling more than 100,000 patients per year in the US and the EU. So very, very large, longer term opportunity. Now, liver dominant cancers are a big problem. And matter of fact, when you have cancer, I think everyone on the line knows that the problem with cancer is it has a tendency to metastasize or spread. One of the places it often spreads to, especially for certain specific types of cancer, is the liver. And when you have liver mets, it often becomes the life-limiting organ. It's what's going to make the patient die. Prognosis is poor when you have a liver met, often under a year, and systemic therapies have limited efficacy. Now, liver-dominant cancers can be very small cancer types, such as ocular melanoma, where about 50,000 of the 3,000 patients a year end up having metastatic disease, which is primarily in the liver. It can be a primary cancer, such as cholangiocarcinoma, which by definition is a type of liver cancer. Or it could be a very large indication like breast cancer, where a small percentage become liver dominant, 2,000 to 5,000 a year. Neuroendocrine's another. Most pancreatic cancers become liver dominant at some point. And then metastatic colorectal is the big one. Most metastases from colorectal cancer start in the liver, and that's about 35,000 a year. And these are all US incidences. So if you look at these numbers, you can see that liver mets or liver primary cancers are a big deal. But again, they're very difficult to treat. Now, the first indication we're going after, as I mentioned before, is metastatic ocular melanoma. There's a significant unmet need for these patients in that there is no standard of care. It's very high incidence of the primary cancer does metastasize to the liver. And once you have a liver met, your life expectancy is usually a year or less. It's a lower risk indication for us. One reason is that there's a great amount of already published data out there using this particular system. And so, we know we have it in the bag in terms of efficacy, and we believe in terms of safety. And there have been multiple publications from third parties using this treatment in Europe. It will be a targeted call point for us. There's probably 20 centers or so that treat about 80% of the patients overall. So we don't need to spend a lot of money to commercialize the product, which is great for a small company such as ourselves. Now, I mentioned before, there are current liver-directed therapies out there, probably about 100,000 treatments a year ongoing. And there really are two types. The first is called TACE, or transarterial chemoembolization, where they use beads to obstruct the blood flow to the tumor, and also sometimes elute chemotherapy. There's about 50 to 60,000 of those in the US a year. Y90 is somewhat similar, where it's radioactive beads with an isotope that has a very short half-life. There are about 10 to 15,000 treatments per year, and not surprisingly, it's the radiation that kills the tumor cells there. For both of these, you have to direct a catheter to get very close to the tumor. With transarterial chemoembolization, you have to get right to the tumor. With Y90, you need to get reasonably close to the tumor. They're both effective, but tumors reoccur, and retreatment is often not possible due to previous disruption of the vasculature. You can't often get to all the tumors with these. You can't always thread a catheter to where you need it to be in the liver to treat the tumor. And also some of the tumors are just not imageable. They're too small. So you might have too many to treat, but too small to see radiographically, or you just can't retreat. So there's definitely a need for treating the whole liver and treating the liver repeatedly. And that's where PHP comes into play. Now, percutaneous hepatic perfusion was designed to replace something called isolated hepatic perfusion. And this is a surgical technique where you essentially do something called a veno-veno bypass with a perfusion circuit. Think of it as hooking the liver up to a heart-lung machine is probably the best way to think of it, and cutting it off from the rest of the body. You do this surgically, very invasive. Very few patients really are applicable to this because of the morbidity associated with it, high treatment-related mortality, excuse me. Not repeatable. Now, what's interesting with this technique is melphalan is the most commonly used agent, and that's the agent used in our system. And it has documented efficacy across multiple tumor types, including metastatic ocular melanoma, the first one we're going after, CRC, a very large indication, as you might remember from an earlier slide, about 35,000 patients a year in the US with liver-dominant CRC, and neuroendocrine tumor. There are others, but those are the three that were most commonly used with IHP. So PHP was designed to replace this system. Now, the way our system works is we thread up through a catheter, a double balloon catheter, and that goes in via the femoral vein in your leg. So it's a minimally invasive procedure here. The balloons are inflated, and in between the two inflated balloons is the hepatic vein. Is forced into that space and goes into fenestrations in that catheter, and the blood exits through the lumen of that catheter. Once it exits, if you swing your eyes all the way over to the right, it goes through those two filters you see. Those two cylinders are filters. And the melphalan-laden blood, the chemo-laden blood, passes through those filters, and they adsorb out the melphalan. So the blood that goes back into the patient, it goes through the internal jugular, melphalan, so you get limited systemic exposure. Now, how does the melphalan get into the patient? Non-systemically, a second catheter is threaded up through the femoral artery and then threaded into the hepatic artery, and that infuses blood into the liver. Now, what's interesting is that most of the blood in the liver is unique. It gets through a vein, a portal vein. Okay, that comes, the portal vein comes from the intestines into the liver. And it's unusual. I won't go into why the body's evolved that way, but there's some important reasons. Most of the tumors that reside in the liver end up drawing their blood from the hepatic artery. So not only are you giving the chemo just to the liver, also you're hooking into the blood flow that primarily goes to the tumor, not to the hepatocytes. So that's why you can deliver 5 to 10-fold concentrations or greater to the liver with a lot less systemic exposure and frankly less exposure to the hepatocytes, which are robust to start with in the liver. So we can deliver very, very high doses centrally to the liver, primarily to the tumor in some ways. And it's a minimally invasive procedure. It takes about 2 to 3 hours in the cath lab. Go home a day later. So I want to take a step back and give a little bit of the history of this company. And it's a little bit of the reason why this exciting, very promising therapy has not garnered a lot of attention, or at least the company hasn't garnered a lot of attention. And that's frankly like a lot of biotech or medical device companies. This company's had a lot of twists and turns over the years. In the 1990s, some surgeons came up with this idea and started developing it. One of the people who came on board as a CEO had a child die of metastatic ocular melanoma, and very passionate about it, and that's how that first indication was chosen. It's a logical indication for a lot of reasons. CRC would have been a larger indication to go after, but metastatic ocular melanoma was where it started. Now, there wasn't a very experienced team in terms of drug development, to be perfectly honest. They started developing this product as a medical device without really taking into account all of the requirements that the Center for Drug Evaluation, CDER, at the FDA would have. They were focused more on what would the device part of the FDA, CDRH, require. And they're very different standards. They completed the phase 3 study and actually received a refusal to file because they had not monitored the trials as you normally would do for CDER. So they went back in and refiled. While they were actually developing the drug, they changed the filter in a number of ways. You can do that in pivotal trials for devices. To some extent, you can't do that with trials for drugs. Now, what happened was the filter had varying efficiency. For some patients, it was in the 90s. For some patients, it was in the 60s. The reason for that is complicated. One of them being they didn't have a good validated release assay to realize how good the filter was doing. And what the net result of that on top of lack of appropriate training for the docs, and again, very different mindset and team then, was that a number of patients died in the trial. Despite that, they got an approval in Europe, because in Europe, for a medical device only, it wasn't regulated as a drug. The standards are far lower, and it got approved under a CE mark, which is really a manufacturing quality type regulatory framework, really nothing about efficacy or safety. So we could get it on the market in Europe. Difficult to get reimbursement with the data in hand, but it got on the market in Europe. The FDA issued a complete response letter. And again, for those who are familiar with the life sciences, you know what that means. But that basically means, hey, we're not going to approve you, and here's a full list of things you have to do to get approved. That set the company way back. And between that and 2016, there was a lot of back and forth with the FDA, new preclinical work, perfecting the filter. That was actually finished by 2013, excuse me. But a lot of back and forth with the FDA before they started the trial, the FOCUS trial in hepatic dominant ocular melanoma, basically their second attempt at a pivotal trial for this indication. That trial was fully enrolled in 2021, and we expect to submit, and we read out the data earlier this year, and we expect to submit to the FDA in first quarter of 2022. There's a 6-month timeline to review responses to our CRL, so we could be on the market by the end of 2022. But between 2016 and 2022, before I joined, there are a number of serial financings with warrants and ratchets, which led to an incredible amount of dilution to existing shareholders. So frankly, there were a number of shareholders who were very angry, and there were a number of, I'll call it biotech gadfly tweet type folks who've really gotten negative on the company. But the FOCUS trial is a very well-designed trial, very well run. It really is history that the company's had to drag along with it prior to fixing all these issues. Now, let me talk about the hepatic dominant metastatic ocular melanoma trial, the FOCUS trial. It is a single-arm trial with 102 patients enrolled, 91 treated. Every 6 to 8 weeks, a patient would receive a course or a session of PHP. If they progressed, they would stop. If they continued to not progress, they would get another treatment up to 6 cycles. The primary endpoint is objective response rate. Okay, and what that means is how many patients at two time points where their tumors shrank 30% or more. We were powered to demonstrate superiority over checkpoint inhibitors, which are approved for melanoma broadly, both ocular and cutaneous. And the upper bound of efficacy for that meta-analysis was 8.3% ORR. So we had to be 8.3% on our lower bound. Our secondary endpoints was duration of response, disease control rate, overall survival, and progression-free survival. Now, this trial started out as a 2-arm trial. This is another wrinkle that people have to think through. It was a randomized controlled study where there was a control arm. The control arm was best alternative care, which meant a list of things that are currently used to treat this disease. The doctor could decide what he wanted to treat the patient with. But because we were approved in Europe, patients were dropping out of the trial when they were randomized to best alternative care and flying over to Europe and paying out of pocket to be treated, or alternatively choosing not to be put in the trial and be put on best alternative care. Because of that, it became very difficult to recruit the trial in a balanced fashion, having the same number of patients in each arm. So what we ended up doing is going back to the FDA and having a series of discussions with them. And it was agreed that we would do a single arm trial. And I'll get into the regulatory implications of that in a moment. So this turned into a single arm trial. But the interesting thing is, because we had a modest number of patients, 30 some odd enrolled in the best alternative care arm, we can do exploratory analyses against the best alternative care. We shouldn't expect statistical significance because there weren't enough patients, but it can be very helpful in the FDA's mind, as well as in prescribers' minds, if they see strong trends against best alternative care. Of course, it would hurt us if they went the other way, but as I'll show in a moment, for the analyses we've done to date, they all go in our favor. Now, let me talk a little bit about a single arm trial, because some folks who don't specialize in investing in oncology companies would say, wait a minute, don't you need two well-controlled randomized controlled trials? Well, we have a first trial that showed definite efficacy. It was a safety issue. And we have a second trial here. The first trial was an RCT, randomized controlled trial. This second one is an overall response single arm trial. What you see on this page here, and I won't read through them all, are all ORR studies, single arm oncology trials with ORR as an endpoint that were approved by the FDA. So for oncology, it's very common because these patient populations, as they're defined, get very, very small. You know, third line, positive for a certain mutation, et cetera, et cetera. You end up with very small patient populations, very difficult to recruit large trials. And so it's very common now for single arm oncology trials to be pivotal trials for approval. So this is a set. There have been a number since I put this slide together, but that's just to give you a sense that this is not an unusual path to take. And again, all our minutes document the FDA agreeing that we could pursue this path. Now, our preliminary analysis that we announced earlier this year was on 87% of the patients. For a number of reasons, we thought it was important to get some data out after I joined the company in October of last year, to give investors a sense that we were on track. There was some feeling, given the history of the company, that we were hiding the ball, that we weren't on track. And I thought it was important to give investors a sense of where we were headed once we had about 90% of the patients analyzed. So in the MILF and HDS arm, which is what matters from a regulatory perspective, we analyzed 79 of the 91 treated. For the best alternative care arm, which frankly the FDA will look at, despite the fact that that's no longer an RCT trial, 29 out of 32 patients were analyzed. So this should give us a very, very good sense of where this trial is headed. Now, the FOCUS trial definitely met its pre-specified criterion for success. There's no way we can lose. Our objective response rate was 29%. It blows away the lower bound, the upper bound, lower bound we need to hit. So we definitely have superiority versus the meta-analysis of checkpoint inhibitors. So we know we have it, and the remaining 11 patients, regardless of what happens, it won't change the results. We have an efficacious treatment here. There's no two ways about it. Now, what's interesting, if you remember, I talked about the best alternative care arm, although they're exploratory endpoints, and it's not part of our primary efficacy analysis. If it went against us, it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing with the FDA, nor in terms of prescribers or when they read the publications. So our meta-analysis was against checkpoint inhibitors, which are commonly used. The other commonly used thing is TACE. And you remember I talked about TACE earlier on. That's one of the local regional treatments with the beads that treat the liver. In this particular trial, most of the docs opted not to use checkpoint inhibitors because the literature was coming out saying they don't work very well, and they chose to use TACE. So we can look at BAC and say, okay, we have systemic therapies being used. We know we did better than that via the meta-analysis in our primary endpoint, ORR. How do we do versus TACE in terms of the other commonly used thing to treat patients? So if you look at our analysis of ORR versus best alternative care, again, primarily TACE, you can see a tripling of ORR, close to 30% versus 10%, as well as disease control rate, is how long can you go before you progress or you're stable. 63% versus 28%. So obviously far, far better for our treatment versus the best alternative care arm. If we next look at the best overall response, again, this is a single time point. Hey, what's the best I did in terms of my tumor shrinkage? You can see 44% of the patients had a time point where they had a 30% or greater reduction in their tumor. Only 17% of the patients on best alternative care had a 30% or greater reduction of their tumor load. Now, the reason why this really matters, this is not a regulatory endpoint. The FDA likes to see 2 time points with 30% or greater reduction, separated by a month or more. The reason why this matters, though, isn't necessarily from a regulatory perspective, but this is what the oncologists look at. They don't pay attention to how many scans do I see. If they see a scan with a large reduction, in their mind, they're going, okay, this thing's working. So about half the patients are going to have a 30% or better reduction in their tumor load on our patient, on our product. Now, in terms of progression-free survival, that's how long you go without a progression of the tumor. We have 9 months versus 3. Now, a number of the patients were censored. We're still gathering this data. Time-based data takes a little while longer to get in hand because you need to have all the scans in hand. So we had about 2/3 of them in for PHB, 3/4 for BAC, but the trend is clear. Much greater progression-free survival timeline than for BAC. Now, treatment emergent adverse events are very important to keep in mind here. This is what hurt us in the prior trial. A number of deaths. There were no deaths in this trial. I can't estimate, push how hard that is. It's very common to have deaths in oncology trials due to the drug. In this case, we didn't have any. And bone marrow suppression of 22% of the patients having a TEAE is not an alarming number at all. This is well within the mix of typical systemic cytotoxic chemotherapeutic agents. You have platinum compounds, you're probably going to be quite a bit worse than this. So this is well within the mix what docs are expecting to see for this type of treatment. So we're very, very happy with the AE profile we've seen to date. Now, what do we have to do to get back on the market here, or get on the market, given we had a CRL in 2013? There were 4 things that were mentioned. The first 3 were medical device related, that human factors validation, preclinical tox. The medical device related basically meant redesign the filter, make sure it was consistent, and we've done that. The second was human factors validation, make sure you appropriately train the docs, because some of the deaths were due to patients being treated who shouldn't have been treated. And we put in place a robust training program. And the last was preclinical tox. This is sort of something you do. It's kind of drug development 101. The company, again, over a decade ago, didn't do this. Again, run by a group of people who really were medical device experts. They didn't know much about drug development. So what's left is overall benefit risk. How safe is this product relative to what is the safety profile and the efficacy profile? So we've seen that we've hit our efficacy hurdle. We've also seen that our safety is well within the mix of normal chemotherapeutic, commonly prescribed chemotherapeutic agents. So we think we're on very, very solid ground for an approval. As I mentioned before, on early 2022 resubmission. There's no 60-day assessment for acceptance to file. So with a normal new NDA, the FDA has 2 months to say, hey, do I want to look at this? And then they have 10 months to do a review. In our case, it's 6 months from submission to a PDUFA target when the FDA needs to tell us whether we're approved or not. Now, from a stakeholder's perspective, when we show these data to oncologists, they're very impressed. They know they see poor responses with systemic therapies. And then when they look at our data, they believe it's a significant advance over other liver-targeted therapies, TACE as an example. Most oncologists believe that about 4/5 of their patients with metastatic ocular melanoma would be HEPZATO candidates. And payer and hospital finance stakeholders suggest they really do expect a very high price point in this niche indication. As an example, the checkpoint inhibitors I've been referring to that are used to treat this, ipilimumab and nivolumab, they cost about $256,000 per year. So that's a marker for you. We believe HEPZATO is likely to be positioned as first-line treatment due to the limited efficacy of the AL therapies. If we say $25,000 to $75,000 per treatment, an average of about 4 treatments per year, let's pick 50,000. The TAM is greater than 200 million in the US. Let's call it 100 million in Europe. That's a $300 million TAM. And again, in Europe, we need reimbursement. Reimbursement is really dependent on getting this trial published. Again, it's been on the market in Europe, but without a lot of supporting data to garner national reimbursement. So the commercialization dynamics are really favorable for a small company. It's a rare disease. Patients seek treatment, usually at regional top national cancer centers. We think about 80% will be treated in the top 20 medical centers. So we think we can use a small but specialized interventional oncology commercial team to market this, perhaps 5, give or take, a few placed regional sales reps to cover 20 centers. And we're going to look for folks with experience navigating hospitals with the drug device combination products and selling to multidisciplinary treatment teams. The gentleman who leads our commercial effort came from a company called BTG that sold one of those products I talked about earlier, Y90, the radioactive beads to treat the liver. So he knows the drill quite well. We're lucky to have him. He's fit for purpose to launch this product. We'll augment the field-based team with clinical support specialists to ensure safe and effective treatments. So we really need to have people in the first, I don't know the exact end, but let's say 5 to 10 treatments to make sure these are done correctly. And then we're going to put in place an experienced market access team. This is sort of pharmaceutical marketing 101, and that's to help the hospitals, the physicians, and the patients navigate reimbursement and make sure we're on both guidelines as well as get the appropriate reimbursement from payers. Now, the European commercialization, I've mentioned a number of times. It's available in 22 centers in 3 countries with that CE mark. It's been added to national treatment guidelines in both Germany and the Netherlands, which is fantastic. And outside of Germany, most of the treatments have been self-pay. So in the UK and the Netherlands is often self-pay. National reimbursement application processes, which will really start the revenue in Europe, will start when the FOCUS trial is fully available. Interestingly, in April of this year, NICE, which is sort of the pharmacoeconomic guidance group in the UK, upgraded ChemoSat status from research to special status, which will allow us to go for national reimbursement and also will facilitate private pay for the 10% or so of UK citizens who have some level of private insurance. So while the revenue is modest to date due to the reimbursement status, it's allowed us to identify indications with strong signals of efficacy. And it also shows us where docs think this might have promise, which is equally important when you think about recruiting trials. So other types of tumor types treated have been intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, which is a primary liver cancer. Colorectal has been common, metastatic breast, pancreatic, neuroendocrine tumors, as well as cutaneous melanoma. So there have been quite a few different tumor types that doctors on their own volition have wanted to try this treatment with. Now, there's incidence and evidence of the incidence of other disease states with high levels of liver tumor burden. I've talked about earlier on, there are quite a few tumor types. But there's supporting data in a number of these on top of the doc's anecdotal experience. I think the ones that I want to focus on are ICC, cholangiocarcinoma. So there's extensive EU experience there, and docs are very excited about what they've seen. And if I drop down to colorectal cancer, remember I talked about isolated hepatic perfusion. That's the system or the surgical procedure which this was designed to replace. Now, the 2 most common places where that was used was metastatic ocular melanoma, where it showed strong treatment results, which came to pass with PHP, the replacement. And if we look at the IHP results in CRC, and again, CRC is a very large indication, we see very impressive response rates for patients who are heavily pretreated, very far along in the disease state, when you expect to have lower response rates. So very impressive response rates with melphalan, with an open surgical procedure, which basically PHP mimics. So we think there's a lot of potential for this product in colorectal, and it's one of the places we're likely to go next. Now, switching to capital structure and share information. It's probably best to look at our share count, looking at the options outstanding, 8.7 million, and then add up the warrants outstanding, 3.6, to get a better understanding of our real market cap. Now, in terms of cash and cash equivalents, at the end of the second quarter, we had 19.4 million, but that excludes 15 million of venture debt we just took in based on a transaction that closed on August 8th. Now, I want to say that that debt provider, Avenue Capital, that did it, had full license to read all our regulatory correspondence with the FDA. They would not have put this money in, and look at our data, they would not have put this money in if they thought that, you know, the presentation I just gave you wasn't actually accurate. They looked at the data, they were convinced, as we are, that we have an approvable product. They also looked at the regulatory correspondence for the FDA. They were convinced the FDA signed off on a single arm trial. So it's good validation for anyone wanting into the company that Avenue did their homework under CDA and was confident we were on the right track. Our cash burn is about $5 to $6 million a quarter. You know, we have those warrants that are about a strike at $10. I think there's a good chance we can get the shares back up and they will convert and give us another source of capital. The $2 million debt that you see on our balance sheet here is from Rosalind Capital. Now, Rosalind, I didn't mention them previously. They have 2 seats on our board. They're the company, the fund that basically turned this company around. It was spiraling due to lack of ability to fund, not due to the fact that it didn't have a robust, good platform. But the past management team just, you know, had lost credibility, rightly or wrongly. They couldn't fund the company. Rosalind put in quite a bit of money, brought in other investors, got the company uplisted from Pink Sheets, and recruited me from a company called Vericel. By the way, when I joined Vericel, the market cap of that company was 30 million. Now it's well over $1 billion, and that occurred in about 5.5 years. I was CFO there. And the reason I left that great gig, great company, was because I see a similar opportunity here as well. So in closing, we have a novel platform in interventional oncology, multiple near-term catalysts, the final data, NDA filing, discussing new indications in October and November when we give an update on data. The safety and efficacy is supported by multiple trials and commercial usage. And I would say I did not share with you the 4 or 5 single and dual center trials out of Europe with similar results as we showed in Focus, but there are plenty of publications out there now on PHP. The initial orphan indication allows for targeted marketing effort and rapid uptake. And lastly, the platform has potential utility in multiple indications. And I can't stress the importance of that and getting trials started. And that's one of my big focus areas at the moment, is trying to choose the right tumor types. It'll likely be ICC and colorectal cancer. And more importantly, the right settings. What part of the disease progression do you want to work on? And what type of protocol? You need to put in place protocols that can be recruited. Now, I'll say on this last point, our largest investor in a funding we did in December, an straight equity deal, was Deerfield Capital. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but they are up there with top 5% of smart money in terms of healthcare. That's all they do is healthcare investing. They are experts in the area. If you don't know them, you should get on their website and look at them. But they were our lead investor in our December financing. So again, another validation that this is, you know, an important platform with tremendous growth opportunity. So with that, I will close it and open this up for questions.
Thank you, Gerard. That's an excellent presentation, and it's really exciting what you have going on and the potential for the company to address a very large unmet need in the treatment of complex cancers in the liver. We do have some questions already, but I want at this time to open the floor to questions from our attendees. I think the easiest way is to just type it into the Q&A or chat box, and we'll make sure that we get it read. I'm just going to read these verbatim. So you mentioned when you'll file the NDA, any comparables. Would you mention the NDA you're going to file in early 2022, correct?
Yeah, the end of the first quarter is the target at the moment.
Okay. And between now and the NDA submission, will there be any significant disclosures of treated patients of the Focus trial?
Yeah, so we've said likely in October, we're going to have an investor day, perhaps early November, where we do 2 things. One is give an update on pretty much the full data set. And secondly, and this is actually the gating item, presenting, what settings are we going to go after and what tumor types, and what is the protocol design, what is the trial design for that, so people have better understanding, not just that there's a set of potential new indications, but how are we going at it? What's the timeline? Because I think that's very important for people to understand.
Great. And another question, when do you think you will be able to apply for a reimbursement code in the US, and who will be representing you in the application process?
So in the US, the way it works is you first want to, well, a couple of things are done in parallel. First of all, this will be primarily an outpatient procedure. So there's something called the CMS midnight to midnight rule. So if you don't go through 2 midnights, you are an outpatient. For drugs delivered as an outpatient, you apply for a J code. You just get that automatically. And that's a pass-through expense. So anyone who's on Medicare or Medicaid, that will automatically be reimbursed. There's kind of the average selling price minus some discount for the government. And then insurance companies for an ultra orphan indication like this are likely just to reimburse it, period. You don't even need to wait to get on guidelines. But with that said, we will work to get on guidelines quickly, NCCN guidelines. And that's something you start working with KOLs now to start talking to the people on that committee. There will not, I don't foresee a real hassle in terms of reimbursement for this, given A, it's ultra orphan indication. B, it'll be a J code, which is kind of a pass through that automatically goes either to the insurance company or Medicare or Medicaid. It's not the type of thing that insurance company, that hospitals will take on the chin in terms of they're getting paid on a DRG basis. That's not the case here. Gotcha. And in terms of who represents us, we're working with some specialized consulting firms to help us through it. But we don't need to have a huge effort in terms of, lobbying the government or that type of thing. This one will be fairly simple. Now, for a small company, it's a lot of work. You got to focus on it. But this is not terribly complex as some other reimbursement issues are.
Do you have any direct competitors using a device drug combo treatment?
No, there aren't any direct, sorry. So TACE is one and Y90 is the other. There's very little to no published data with either of them, which puts them really at a huge disadvantage once we're approved. And secondly, with TACE, we showed fairly low response rate relative to us in the best alternative care arm. And again, those were exploratory analyses because the trial ended up being a single arm. But believe me, if it went against us, it would hurt with the FDA and with payers, but it went our way, so it's great. So that's the existing local regional competitor, and that's, I guess you call it a drug-eluting beads drug device. But to give a more comprehensive answer, the other on-the-market treatment are systemic checkpoint inhibitors, ipilimumab, nivolumab, and others. Those have very low efficacy, and it's well understood. They were approved for melanoma, and I don't know whether it was a glitch with the FDA or whether it was purposeful. Very little data on ocular melanoma. They were basically approved based on cutaneous melanoma data, but they got a label that said melanoma. And the two are very different diseases, but hence docs tried it, they got paid for it, didn't work. The other treatment that's worthy of mention is in phase 3. It's called tebentafusp from a company called Immunocore. They do not have very solid overall response rate. It's a fraction of what ours are. And to be fair, immunological agents, and that's what tebentafusp is, it's a little tough to measure how effective they are using radiographic evidence. But looking at the data, it doesn't look terribly impressive. Secondly, they can only treat patients who have a specific phenotype of HLA. Okay, they have to be HLA-A positive to be treated. That's about half the patients. Secondly, I think all patients will rotate through, all HLA positive patients will rotate through both therapies. And that's because unfortunately, even with our therapy or theirs, you're going to progress. Now, in our case, if you catch the patient really early, maybe you can postpone it for years. That's another story. But for most patients you catch, they have fairly, significant liver burden already, and they're gonna end up passing through both treatments.
Gerard, as somebody who's presided over the care of a number of patients who've gotten TACE, transarterial chemoembolization, I go on record saying I'm not convinced it does anything. I don't know of anybody who. I'm amazed it's still being done. I'll put it that way. It's certainly no competition to you at all.
Yeah, I've heard payers may stop paying for it.
Yeah, I think they should. Really, they should. Yeah.
We have a question from, which is a great question. When you look at the stock price where it is now, why do you think? I mean, it's trading close to a low. We think it's incredibly undervalued here. Why do you believe the stock price is where it is? Lack of exposure? Do you have any analyst coverage? And if so, who are the analysts and what are the target prices?
Sure. The target prices are all pretty much in the mid to high teens for those that have target prices. The analysts are Canaccord, Orlinda, Maria Theobald at BTIG, Scott Henry at Roth, and I'm missing one for a moment now. I'm embarrassed.
No, it's okay.
In a minute. But in terms of why the stock is where it is, that's a great question, and the reason is multifactorial. One is, I mentioned it's been a long journey for this company, so a lot of people got burned. So people who were paying attention are kind of burned out or negative on the story. The prior management team was less than forthright with investors. When I came on board, there were a number of cleanup items that I had to do, ranging from, hey, we're still recruiting patients, and some investors were under the impression that we weren't. So timing was off, to the trial had been paused for all intents and purposes due to the company running out of money, which slowed things down. That never was shared. There were a host of things like that that really annoyed investors. There were some financings that were done with effectively full ratchet warrants that led to massive dilution. And when I say massive, I mean literally over $1 billion to 1 in terms of reverse stock splits. So that just really burned people. Lastly, when we announced our top line data in pre-market, the stock was well over 20, in the mid 20s. And then there was a gentleman called Adam Feuerstein, who's a kind of a biotech gadfly, who tweeted that we missed our endpoint. And I've been talking to investors about, to keep it simple, that what we had to achieve was 21%. That's what the trial was powered. If we hit that as a point estimate, we were in good shape. We hit 29. He looked at the statistical range of 19 all the way up to 30 some odd and said, oh, they must have missed it. And he didn't take the time to read the full press release. He tweeted, and people shorted the heck out of the stock, and it dropped like a rock in the pre-market. So it was on its way up, but this was, again, somebody who had been following the company for years. He actually gotten into, I don't know whether real or virtual shouting matches with the CEO at the time. And frankly, Adam was right at the time. I mean, he was absolutely right with the call he made on the company, but he's wrong now. And again, I would say I wouldn't have joined this business. I wouldn't have come from where I came from, Vericel, if I hadn't done my due diligence and done, and really thought long and hard about this. This product works. It'll extend patients' lives. Part of it's on me. I need to be, I need to maybe clone myself and be outward focused as well as inward focused. But I just need to get the word out. And it's one of the reasons we're doing this type of thing with retail investors, is to try to get the word out. I've got a number of banks, brand name banks, that will pick up coverage, but I think we all know what's required to pick up coverage. And I don't want to say it. If you do a financing, it's more likely than not that a bank's going to pick it up, even though it's not supposed to work that way. It seems to work that way. I've picked up 2 analysts since I joined. BTIG and Canaccord were not part of our mix when I joined. It really was. So those are 2 very solid banks. I have a number of other larger brand name banks that have basically said to me, hey, we'd love to pick up coverage. But to make that happen, generally you need to do a financing. And I'm not going to do serial financings at this price just to get coverage.
Right.
Gerard, have the toxic warrants expired?
Yeah, they're all gone. It's all cleaned up. It's all done.
What about the $10 warrants? Do you know the expiration on those?
They're about 4 years out, so
good.
they've got a ways to run. And those are good. I mean, those warrants are fine, and they will convert at some point. And part of it, the headwind of the overall market doesn't help us at the moment either.
Right. Can you talk, speaking of financing, how much capital do you think will be needed to get you to commercialization eventually?
Well, we probably have enough now to get to launch. Now that would mean running on fumes, which we're not going to do. But I think there's probably needs to be an equity raise prior to launch, between now and prior to launch, and probably one more thereafter, or maybe it'll be a synthetic royalty-based deal. I've done those in the past to try to minimize dilution. But yeah, there'll be another equity raise. I can dance around that point, but it wouldn't be credible between now and launch. Now, I don't like the price, and if I have to do a round between now and launch at this price, I would probably first go to the insiders and see if I can do it, and see what I can do with the warrant holders, maybe with the restruck price or something. Again, I don't want to put new shares out there and to new investors at these levels. Right. So that will be my last choice.
Right. Can you talk about the? You touch base, obviously you talked about the FOCUS trial. Can you talk about the ALIGN trial briefly?
Yeah, so that's another cleanup matter for me when I joined. The previous management team was talking that trial ongoing. They had not recruited a patient in well over a year. They only had like 3 patients recruited. For all intents and purposes, the trial was not running.
It was hard to recruit for, though.
It was very hard to recruit for. They only had 3 centers. They were not focused on it. And the protocol itself was under a SPA with the FDA, and a special protocol amendment. And what that means is the FDA says, yeah, we're likely to approve you if you hit this safety level. Now, SPAs, in my opinion, are silly things to run after. People think they're great. Some investors think, oh, look, the FDA's agreed, blah, blah, blah. The FDA never agrees to anything. They always have an out. And if you try to push them on a SPA, try to get one, they just raise the bar. And you end up with the protocol, either you can't recruit, you can't finish, or the efficacy is near impossible to achieve. So SPAs are, in my mind, a naive thing to run after. And we have a SPA now for ICC. We're going to change that protocol and probably lose the SPA. I'm not going to lose a wit of sleep over it. We're going to change the protocol so we can recruit it. But just in short, one of the reasons it's difficult to recruit is you had to be treatment naive. You rarely get treatment naive patients showing up for a clinical trial. So it's just not going to happen.
Okay. Given the long history of the company, can you comment on the IP and the time remaining?
Yeah, sure. We have IP that goes out another decade or so on the filter, and we're always adding to it. But again, in complete disclosure, I would expect if someone really wanted to get into this, they could design around it if they tried real hard and spent the money. But with that said, they'd have to rerun all the trials. There's no ANDA. There's no 505(b)(2) mechanism. There's no way to get in the market and say, hey, with the same product, different PK, different delivery, whatever. You're going to have to rerun all the trials. Now, could I see in 5 years, 6, 7 years, someone going, hey, this is big. They're selling 800 million of this thing. Saying, yeah, let's follow on. Yeah, I could see that. But not within the investment horizon of any of us in terms of competition. And that was similar to my last company, Vericel. We had no IP. They were all old cell therapy products that we purchased from Sanofi. It didn't matter. Yeah. And there's still nobody working on those, even though they're selling well over 100 million a year now.
Can you talk about the margins for the Hepzato kit and the treatments? Are you dialed into that in terms of what you'd be looking at for margin?
Yeah, I mean, it at the very high price point, that helps us. Low volumes hurts us, probably, plus 80% margins, 85% margins initially. We ramp up into, tens of thousands of patients a year. We could get into the 90% plus margins at those prices. If we eventually lower the prices, because we're going after much, much higher volume tumors, as the price comes down, the volumes are going to go up and it'll probably be a net wash. So something in the 80s initially, and then I think we can start pushing towards 90 as volumes go up.
And the overall feedback.
Those are gross margins. Those are gross margins.
Okay. Obviously. Yep. And overall, the feedback from the doctors in Europe so far, how has that been?
The doctors like the product. They want to see it reimbursed. So right now in Germany, they get reimbursed under a ZE scheme, which is in every country is a bit different. But in this case, every year the hospitals go, hey, we have this procedure and this product that seems to work real well. Can we please carve out some extra money for it? But they have to make a proactive process to ask for it. It's not reimbursed like a DRG, but there's a number of centers in Germany that do that. Netherlands, it's not reimbursed, but hospitals are taking it out of their own budget and losing money on it. And in the UK, it's almost all private pay. The UK ended up being our premier place probably in terms of volume because people are flying into the UK and paying out of pocket for it. Or coming out of Ireland and doing it, or local within the UK. I'd say about 2/3 of the patients, 3/4 were Brits, and the rest were kind of flying in.
In terms of training doctors for the procedure, I mean, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the training. Yeah,
so it's not really any more difficult than some other procedures they do. So they're not, with that said, you can kill a patient if you do it wrong, like a lot of things. And we don't want to, A, see patients harmed, obviously, and B, we don't want to sully the brand by that occurring. So we are going to be, probably error on the side of overtraining and, making sure docs have to pass, kind of a little bit of a test. Hey, do you answer this question and that question? And we will make sure whether it's a proctor arrangement, which means another doc who's been trained flies in and we pay him or her, or whether or not it's our own clinical support specialist there in the OR. We will, for all these centers, for some non-insignificant number, make sure we're there for everyone until we're comfortable, and still check in on an occasional basis.
Anthony, it really does tend to be pretty much part of the standard vascular radiology repertoire of things for the most part. So I think they're on solid ground there.
Yeah. Great.
Now, I think just to add to that, what that means is the number one rate limiter for uptake once we launch will be how many sites are trained and running. And the way to assist that is to make sure we have as many expanded access protocol sites up and running at the time of launch. So we've submitted an expanded access protocol, or EAP, to the FDA. They have 30 days. We submitted it last week. They have 30 days to respond. If they don't say boo, we can start enrolling patients in centers. I think we're starting with 3 centers initially. But between those and any additional phase 2s or phase 3 trials we start running, or IITs in the US, I'd like to have 8 to 10 centers up, trained and running by the time we launch, knock on wood, towards the end of next year.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think we're going to leave it there. We're right at an hour. Gerard, I want to thank you and Mark for both coming on today and getting us up to speed on Delcath's investigational product, the Hepzato Kit. And we certainly look forward to following the company's progress as you continue to report results on your trial. I have to say, you look at the year, the 52-week high in the stock is what, roughly 25, and we're close to a low. I think this represents a tremendous value down here, and I hope everybody on this call is going to take a long, hard look.
Gerard, you really packed a wallop for an hour. I like
it. For sure. Very thorough.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, you're welcome. And in the meantime, you can get additional information on Delcath Systems at the company's comprehensive website at delcath.com, including details on Hepzato Kit, as well as additional information and press releases. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, and I will make sure Gerard gets it if I can't answer it. But we want to thank all of our attendees for taking the time today to learn more about the company, and we look forward to your attendance on a future webcast presented by Torrey Hills. So until then, everybody be safe, be well, and thanks, Gerard and Mark, and we will talk to you soon.
All right, take care. Bye.
Thanks.